Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, European leaders have shown openness to the use of COVID-19 vaccines from China and Russia. Will a change of attitude speed up vaccine rollout in Europe? Google threatens to pull services from Australia, then offers news showcase in compromise. What's behind the row between the tech giant and Australian regulators? And this week's newsmaker, now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. Europe is now facing a vaccine shortage as producers are supplying vaccines slower than anticipated. In response, the EU is opening opportunities to buy Chinese and Russian vaccines. How soon will the vaccines get market authorization in the EU, and how much impact can the Chinese and the Russian vaccines bring to the control of the virus in Europe? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Professor Chen Hong from East China Normal University and Professor Wu Zhiwei, Director of the Center for Public Health Research at Nanjing University Medical School. So welcome to the show. I will start with Zhiwei. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that the COVID vaccines from Russia and China could be approved for use in the EU if they show all the data. Zhiwei, so from the medical point of view, we see why there's a change of the attitudes toward the Russian and the Chinese vaccines here.
Well, EU is under tremendous pressure in terms of vaccination its people. So far the EU has only vaccinated 3% of the population, comparing with the 15% in the UK and the 10% in the US. And there are a lot of other hurdles as well. And also the vaccine producers also running into some production problems as well. AstraZeneca just downplay the possibility of supplying sufficient vaccine doses to EU as scheduled. So the European Union definitely is under a tremendous pressure right now. I mean, the economy is shut down, the travel is restricted, and also, a lot of other activities also canceled. So they need a vaccine to basically boost the confidence and prevent the disease transmission.
Mm-hmm. Well, this started with the German health minister basically saying that, Russian and Chinese vaccine that can help, to make up for the shortage of the vaccines. And then you have Chancellor Merkel basically pointing to Hungary by, their fast pace of immunization by relying on the Chinese vaccines. So can Chinese or Russian vaccines here step in and help relieve the shortage of the vaccines?
Yes, I think it definitely can. If you look at how the Chinese vaccine and the Russian vaccine, which just published in the Lancet, that both are highly effective vaccines, and also they are safe as well. And those two vaccines actually is a very important vaccine, product in the market right now. I mean, those vaccines are being approved by various different countries. I think this will definitely help Europeans to solve the current scenario, the problems. The other thing is that if EU actually delays or EU is hesitating in terms of proving the Chinese and the Russian vaccines, I think some of European countries will just go ahead as Hungary did. And also we just read news that Czech Republic's Prime Minister just visited Hungary, that if the vaccine actually is it's delayed or whatever, if not approved by the EU, Czech Republic will probably just go ahead and proving by itself.
Mm-hmm. Professor Chen Hong, obviously this is not only about the vaccination, this is not only about a medical purpose operation over there. Let's be frank, it's also about the politics. Australian Chancellor said that there should be no geopolitical taboos when it comes to the approval of COVID-19 vaccine. He also said we will only be able to defeat the pandemic through international cooperation. As Professor Wu said, yes, that Czech Prime Minister also said vaccines are not a political question, but one of safety. What do you make of the subtle change of attitudes, a gradual change of attitudes, let's say, from the European Union?
Well, first of all, I think actually because there's a really severe shortage of supply in Europe, because in the very beginning, of course, as we know that the EU stipulated that the member countries of the EU should be, having the procurement of the vaccine in a concerted way. But actually, the UK and also Pfizer in the United States, they failed to, fulfill the contract, on the previous contracts, of the timely and prompt, delivery of the vaccine. So actually the urgency, the imperative in Europe actually makes them to find some additional sources, in particular in this case, of course, the Chinese vaccines and also the Russian Sputnik vaccine. I think actually in the West, the people used to frankly speaking, they often try to interpret and also to understand things in a very ideological and a political way. For example, like previously, the mask wearing was actually being handled and treated in a geopolitical manner. So that actually, wearing masks was actually regarded as a kind of political, stance. So in this way, actually, vaccine, especially the sources of vaccines were actually being regarded also once again in a geopolitical perspective. But this is definitely a wrong wrong way of understanding and also of treatment of the situation, because really vaccines are used to save lives, and actually political perspectives, especially misguided perspectives, can be costing lives, especially of course in this crisis, medical crisis, costing millions of lives.
Well, as you said, we should actually have a distinction between this medical purpose. It's about saving lives. It's about for the public safety, health over there. On the other hand, unfortunately, you do see the politicization of the pandemic, the politicization of the vaccine even. If you look at the recent remarks by the French President Macron, on one hand, he said, oh, this is a diplomatic success for China in its effective and efficient distribution and production of vaccines. He's not completely welcoming the Chinese vaccine, but he's not really rejecting the Chinese vaccine either. So it's kind of difficult, right, for the West, let's say, for European countries somehow to accept, vaccines from either China or Russia, given their differences. But do you think ultimately they will accept that?
Yes. Well, I think actually one thing people in the West during this crisis they need to learn is actually we need to live with and also work in spite of various differences. We do have systemic differences, for example, in society, in ways of governance. But in spite of that, actually, we have common goals. So I think in China, actually, we always regard actually the common goal as the most important thing. We talk about, the community of humanity with a shared future. We talk about sharedness, something that is in common, rather than, intensifying and magnifying, differences. So I think actually, President Macron's remarks are actually typically, expressive of such kind of, contradictory mentality. On one hand, they really do see actually the importance, the efficacy and also safety of the Chinese vaccines. But on the other hand, they still regard China as politically, different, with, always regarding the world with a tinted glasses. So that is actually definitely something that is outdated and need to be eradicated. We need to work together because we do have a common future, in particular facing medical and also economic crisis.
Well, Professor Wu, one of the Chinese vaccines, Sinovac, has just announced that it has officially filed for conditional market authorization for its COVID-19 vaccine, CoronaVac, with China's regulator in Beijing. So yesterday, Sinovac released its latest phase 3 clinical trial data. So tell us more about the Chinese vaccines, Professor Wu. One is, we just mentioned, the other is Sinopharm, and probably a third one is still in the third phase of clinical trial. Tell us more about that, in particular our viewers from in European countries or in the United States, say.
Well, first, all the current Chinese vaccines are based on the traditional technology, which are very safe. we know a lot about those vaccine technologies, and also those vaccines in the early clinical trial, like phase 2 and phase 3, we know that they are very safe. They only cause very minor adverse effects. And from various different regions, the trial population analysis shows that those vaccines are actually effective. They induce needed immune response fighting the virus. So basically, what I could conclude is that those vaccines are safe and effective. The thing is that those vaccines, once they are approved by China, and also in the a little bit earlier back to the last year, some of the vaccines have been approved, accepted by not only in China, but other countries as well, to vaccinate those highly, susceptible populations as well. So far, what we know is that those vaccines are very safe. There is no problem at all. So I think, based on the general principles that utilizing the vaccine has to be safe and effective, they should meet the EU's requirement. The thing is that the real question is how fast the European Medicine Agency would be able to approve those vaccines. We know that in all the vaccine rollout, the EU is slow in basically procure the vaccines, in approving the vaccines, and also in other logistic issues as well. So this is something actually EU has to resolve by itself. That in a desperate situation, they have to expedite the whole process.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Chen Hong, we know that the new administration in Washington, D.C. has been basically, their China policy is about working together with their allies against China. So on multiple fronts, probably. But at the same time, we see, China and the EU, they do have their common interests in investment and trade, or continuous investment and trade. And how about this vaccine cooperation in the fight against the pandemic, in the fight by having more vaccination over there? If there's a successful cooperation, how will that help the two sides to build more trust for further cooperation, let's say?
Yes. First of all, I should say that the current shortage of supply in Europe, part of the reason is because actually the new Biden administration announced that the United States government should be providing 100 million doses of the Pfizer vaccines within 100 days. So that is why actually the Pfizer company, the pharmaceutical company, actually they cut back on the supplies on the delivery of the Pfizer vaccines to Europe, to the rest of the world. That is part of the reason. So that's really, actually, we should still see there's a preoccupation with the so-called America First doctrine that is still at play. On the other hand, of course, China, I think, actually has been always regarding the vaccine as a global public good. So with Europe, for example, China has been working with the EU and also some non-EU countries. For example, like Serbia, they have been already going on with the national rollout of the vaccination, which has been turning out to be quite smooth and also hopefully successfully. And I think with the EU, China has signed the BIT with EU. So throughout these crises, whether it's financial crisis or whether this is a public health crisis, actually China has been working with various partners in this context, of course, with the EU, so that actually we can still see that actually there will be, further more, extensive and expensive, cooperation between the two sides. So BIT and also the vaccine cooperation could be the stepstone or the springboard for the two sides to work together for a better future, especially in the post-pandemic era.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you to Professor Chen Hong and Wu Zhiwei. We have been talking about the possible cooperation between EU and China, Russia on vaccination. Now we turn to the battle between Australia and Western tech giants Australia's new legislation would ask Google and Facebook to pay Australian media outlets for news content. It would be the world's first law doing so. In response, Google first threatened to pull its search engine from Australia and then introduced its own paid-for platform called News Showcase, in what many see as an attempt to undercut the proposed legislation. Will Australia do without Google or Facebook in the future? To find out more, we are joined by Kim Windery, an Australian publisher and writer. Welcome to the show, Kim. So Australia could become the first country to require Facebook and Google to pay for news content provided by media companies, and a royalty-style system that would become law this year. So what's your view on the new Australian legislation?
Well, first of all, it actually won't be the first. Google introduced something very similar to, as they call News Showcase in France not that long ago, which is based on paying publishers essentially a royalty on some of their content published by Google News. And it's the same proposal that Google has now put forward in Australia to counter the legislation that's currently being debated in Parliament. So it's not a first, but it's going to be very interesting to see what comes next.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Chen, Google has previously said the legislation was unworkable and would force it to pull out of the country altogether if implemented. So tell us, of course, Google is defending itself by saying that the legislation is unworkable. So what's the response from Australian government? Obviously, they believe it is workable.
Well,
yeah, I think actually the Australian government has been
quite Limited in particular, and Nine Media, which are by far the two most dominant mainstream media organizations in Australia, and they're the ones that have driven this.
Professor Chen, please.
So, oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Okay. But, I think really, Kim has got a point in pointing out, actually, the Australian side, I should say, actually, the Australian government has been, carrying out with this legislation and also the enactment of the legislation in a quite impulsive way, in a quite rash way. I don't think, actually, this is really something that's a government with sensibility should be doing in this time of digitalization, in this time of information, because indeed, this world, depends upon share of information rather than, a kind of creating a kind of like information insularity. Because actually, really, on one hand, of course, the Australian news media and also the media outlets could be, losing some kind of profits from, providing, contents to such large tech giants such as, Google or YouTube or Facebook. But on the other hand, of course, Australian news media are still, frankly speaking, quite, less known, around the world. So that actually the those search engines and also social media, platforms, they create the springboards for those media outlets to, have access to the wider audience, and that is actually the two-way process. So on one hand, of course, the media outlets, they provide content. On the other hand, with such accessibility to the readership, because frankly speaking, most of the Australian newspapers, they provide quality content to subscribers, not free of charge. Mm-hmm. So by accessing, by providing the links to the readers, they are still actually quite trying to induce, those subscription, which is actually also profit generating.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kim, Google has offered an option basically for Australian government. They call it like a news showcase. Tell us more about that. What is it, the model? Will it be acceptable to the Australian government?
There were some indications today. The Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, indicated that they wanted to look closely at Google's suggestions for using what they call the News Showcase. So I think that that's probably a workable solution. I think that's most likely what is going to happen. And I think Google's threat to leave Australia, although it has been, I think it is a real threat for different reasons, but I don't think it's going to happen. There is an election in Australia this year, and I do not think that the government will want to go to an election being responsible for Google search not longer being available in Australia.
Okay, so you, in a recent article, you expressed that you're obviously discontent with the government's the legislation. Tell us more about that.
Well, it's all about the money. It is really all about the money of old media trying to wrest some money back that they've lost to Google and Facebook, and have thus used the regulator, the ACCC, Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, to impose this regulation under the guise of providing quality journalism. But it really is all about the money, and it does nothing to protect consumers, and it certainly does nothing to protect independent media, which I represent, in terms of our ability to provide quality journalism and investigative journalism, and making that available to Google, to people via Google search and social media platforms. So it really is all about the money, and the legislation does not really achieve the objectives that it purports to set out.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kim, tell us, the Australian media scene. We know traditional media worldwide is suffering from the challenge with the rise of social media. I think Australia is not an exception. The government legislation obviously is in the name of protecting quality journalism, protecting the traditional media. I mean, how distressful are they in terms of their finance?
Oh, I think old media is in a lot of distress because they've lost a lot of their revenue streams to online and to classifieds. That's been happening for decades, literally. Independent media is a little bit different because we normally have a different business model. But I do think there are lots of other alternatives, both in Australia and elsewhere. Media regulation in no country has actually sort of followed up with the advent of the internet. So media legislation is still based on old broadcast, broadsheet, radio media, and doesn't really cover the online world at all. And I think there's a lot of different things that certainly the Australian government should be doing and should look at in terms of curbing the immense power that Google and Facebook and other social media has. Well, that's a worldwide problem.
Well, to second the opinion, here are some numbers. In the government report, it found that Google controls 90% of the digital display advertising sector, which is worth $2.6 billion US, and 70% of the revenue. So what do you make of this, huge some amount of money, controlled actually by Google in Australia?
Well, it is also a reflection of how people use the internet, and I don't think that is the biggest problem. I think in a lot of ways competition over time will take care of that. I think the focus needs to be on limiting the impact that Facebook, for instance, has, and as we've seen in US elections and elsewhere, through fake news and the use of personal data in ways it was never intended to. So I think regulation around privacy, regulation around how you treat online publishers, and in my mind, Facebook, for instance, is a publisher to the extent that Google publishes news. They are a publisher, and they need to be regulated accordingly and be responsible for the content that they provide. And as a consumer of media, I think those things are much more important than to protect the revenue streams of other media giants.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Kim. Thank you for talking to us about the Australian media scene over there. Well, let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's Newsmaker. Professor Chen, Proud Boys. I'm not sure everyone is familiar with this organization. Tell us, what kind of organization is Proud Boys? Why the Canadian government decided to define them as a terror organization over there?
Okay, Proud Boys is actually an organization established in Texas, United States. It is a male-only group. Actually, they, pride themselves as being, Western chauvinistic. They're, white supremacist, organization. They often argue for example, like anti-Muslim, anti-immigration, anti-Semites, anti-homosexual. A lot of, rightist. Extremism, in their indoctrination and also ideology, and they actively, opposes their, opponent, that is actually Antifa, which is actually a leftist extreme, movement in the United States. It is said that actually the Proud Boys actually they played a very important part, a pivotal part in the riots at the Capitol Hill in the United States in early January. And that is actually something that is being, causing alerts around the world, and in this case, of course, in Canada, because in the recent years we see, the Proud Boys was established in 2016. And since its establishment, there have been some kind of violent, incidents of violence, linked with it, and they always instigate, browse, violence activities, with the community and also with Antifa, and of course, in particular, of course, as we said, their pivotal role in the Capitol Hill insurrection. I think actually the Canadian government acted quite quickly, trying to stop them from, being active within the Canadian borders, and also from the American Antifa members, Proud Boy members, from crossing the border into the Canada,
Well, there's a total of 6 white supremacist, and neo-Nazi groups have been designated by, terrorist entities in Canada. So prior to 2018, no such groups were ever listed as a terror threat. So Professor Chen, what does this tell us about this right-wing, white supremacist movement in North America, let's say?
Yeah, I think this is a worrying sign that actually there has been a resurgence of white supremacism and also racism that is actually happening in North America and also elsewhere in the world, because really, we have seen a kind of resurgence of, extremism, in particular with some kind of a right-wing ideology, and sometimes they are not merely, dwelling upon, ideas or speeches, but really resorting to, acts of violence. And, this is really very worrying. For example, like Proud Boys, we see they can really, to be acting, for example, although, for example, in Canada, they are now, outlawed and, was, simply being, prevented from being active. But really, in the name of free speech, in the name of, various kinds of, possibilities, they can see loopholes of the law and try to be active again, and they can even regroup into another group in another name, so that actually they can re-emerge into the society, and with even further activities, because they are learning a new pattern of operation, and they are being designated as a kind of terrorist operation, and that is really particularly alarming.
Well, thank you, Professor Chen. And we all know, of course, former President Trump in the first debate with then the candidate, presidential candidate Biden, he said that Proud Boys stand back, stand by. So since that time, actually, everybody probably is becoming more aware of Proud Boys. With that, we're coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for watching. See you next week.